Chapter 581, Taming the Fourth Year, Journey, Struggle Start. Luna and Leora arrive at the castle, followed by the two maids and the four remaining guards, Umi, Hikari, Hana, and Kira, all looking somewhat disheveled after the discussion they had had in the dormitories. The evidence of their confrontation was written across their bodies in bruises and torn clothing. Luna and Leora, being dual tamers, made them a major problem for their caretakers now. Umi was still rubbing her shoulder, the joint clearly tender from whatever technique had been used against her. Hikari wore an expression caught between worry and genuine surprise. She had never seen Lady Luna angry enough to use so much power against her own guards. Lady Luna, Hannah murmured as they approached one of the castle walls, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had already lost one argument and feared losing another. "We still believe this is a mistake. Escaping from the academy, using so much force against poor us." "I did it because you had no choice," Luna responded without turning around, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had thought through the consequences. "You had orders to keep me there. If you're not somewhat beaten up, they're going to punish you for not fulfilling your role. Although I told you to stay there and say that we had escaped later. It was too strange." Rin and Julius had felt the same energy signature from that day. Without doubt, here, below during the entire excavation, in their concentration on coordinating Earth control, had the abomination escaped? Had it hidden in deeper tunnels while they worked? No. Suddenly they felt the signature again, stronger than before. There was something directly beneath them. A black claw emerged suddenly from the earth, moving with a fluidity that defied its woody appearance. Its fingers, long and curved like ancient tree branches, closed around the empty crystal sphere. Rin recognized it immediately, though something had changed. "The tree-shaped claw," he murmured, instinctively backing away as recognition sent ice through his veins. But this time it was completely different from the 3 previous occasions when he had come here. It wasn't opaque like the first time, when it had simply been a useful object to mark the path. It also wasn't covered with golden fungi, like the second time, and it definitely wasn't absent like the third time, when the entire area had been empty. Had it moved by itself? While Rin watched with fascinated horror, he could distinguish small lines of violet light flowing through the claw's internal structure. They weren't as dark as corruption marks, but they had a disturbing similarity to it, and part of his own energy that made his stomach contract with revulsion. The claw closed with devastating force and crushed the crystal sphere, as if it were a clay bowl. The fragments fell between its fingers while it turned and pressed itself against the earth, using the leverage to push its body upward. Zhao launched one of his feathers with great force, but it bounced off without effect, leaving barely a scratch on the surface that should have been vulnerable to stronger-than-gold rank attacks. The enormous entity kept pushing itself upward, everyone back. Julius shouted, but his voice sounded more fascinated than alarmed. Like everyone present, he was witnessing something that defied his understanding of the world, something that challenged the very categories they use to make sense of reality. Google see Novi Fire.net. A complete arm slowly emerged from the ground. It wasn't simply the claw Rin remembered, but a complete extremity that extended several meters in length. The surface was marked by intricate patterns that seemed to combine artificial design with organic growth, as if it had been sculpted and then grown by itself. The enormous artifact that supposedly had been deactivated by corruption. Rin had no way of knowing that Bloodwind and Hagen's group had already seen the complete form of this arm months ago, when they had been destroying the cradle in the same region. He didn't know that since that moment, the enormous artifact had moved locations, ending up underground when the tide of corrupt beasts that deactivated returned to their place. What he could feel was that this ancient artifact had been activated again, but no longer belonged to the original energy it had been designed to serve. Now it served something else, something that had corrupted its fundamental purpose. When the entirety of the arm finally emerged, Rin could see that it's based in anything recognizable. Instead, it was connected to a sphere similar to the one it had just destroyed, but this sphere was horribly integrated. The sphere wasn't the end, the object this time. Now it was fused, connected with horrendous pulsating organic systems that extended like grotesque veins along what gradually revealed itself as the back of an enormous abomination. "By all the dragons," Zhao whispered, his wings extending automatically in preparation for combat. Maybe the organic part could be damaged. The creature emerging was now different from anything they had faced before. It wasn't simply a corrupt or mutated beast. It was an impossible fusion of ancient technology, organic growth, and a corruption that defied categorization. Its main body was the size of a 4-story building, covered with plates that seemed to be both armor and skin. Sections pulsed with their own rhythm, as if powered by multiple hearts or cores beating in disturbing syncopation. "What the hell is that?" Lou asked, his voice broken by terror. Rin studied the creature, tried to connect what he was seeing with fragments of knowledge he had obtained during his years with his fungus and the battle with the abomination alongside Han. There was something familiar in the energy patterns of these creatures, and their connections to things that weren't part of their natural system. "I think it's a hybrid," he finally murmured, the words carrying the weight of terrible understanding. Something that was one thing, that was converted into another thing, and that has now become a completely different third thing. The abomination raised what could have been eyes, though they were disordered and scattered across what might have been a face. When its attention focused on the group of humans, most forgot it was time to attack. Min instinctively backed away, his usual confidence evaporating. "Can we run?" Julius quickly evaluated their options, noting that the creature could be the reason for the advance of the smaller ones. If this thing was coordinating the horde, then stopping it here might save thousands of lives in the city. They had to try. "Attack together," he responded, softlier than expected. But before they could react, the abomination emitted a sound that wasn't exactly a roar, but rather a deep resonance that was felt as much in the ears as in the bones. Julius quickly looked at Run, expecting to see him affected on the ground again as he had been during their previous encounter. But Run was standing with gritted teeth, unconsciously touching the letter in his pocket while feeling the new stability of his energy core. The corruption that had once made him vulnerable to such influences had been mostly purified, leaving him with defenses he hadn't possessed before. Jade scales began covering his body as he prepared for the fight that could help the city filled with the people he had sworn to protect. Chapter 582, Taming the Fourth Year, Journey, Struggle. The insistent seed inside Rin seemed to vibrate in response to the creature's shriek, but not with the uncontrolled intensity of the first time. The black roots began growing again, but remained small for the moment, thin filaments extending barely a few centimeters under his skin like delicate veins of corruption held in check. The sensation was uncomfortable but manageable, unlike before, when the marks had threatened to consume him entirely. Now they felt more like extra power, a tool he could potentially control rather than a force that would inevitably engulf him. The group finally began to fight when Rin endured the intense sensation pulsing through his core and launched into attack. He channeled his most powerful yet still controllable amount of elemental energy into a powerful light, ray directed straight at the abomination's torso. The black arm intercepted part of the attack, without receiving visible damage, but the main impact connected with the creature's body with violence. One of the protective plates disintegrated under the assault, revealing beneath its semi-transparent violet flesh that pulsed with that unnatural, irregular life. And within that flesh, glowing like a corrupted gem, there was a core, like the other mutant beasts. Rin shouted while jumping backward and dodging a counterattack from the arm claw. "It must have several cores, too. We need to find them all." Zhao immediately seized the opening Run had created, his experience allowing him to read the battlefield in an instant. He launched a succession of feathers that pierced the exposed flesh like guided projectiles. Each feather found its mark, drilling deep until they impacted the brilliant core at the center. When the core was destroyed, a powerful and unnatural shriek resonated from what might have been the abomination's throat, confirming that the attack had worked. A small part of the organic systems connecting the sphere to its back visibly withered. Julius seized the creature's moment of disorientation to attack another section. Giant mineral claws, empowered by his Qilin, tore through another protective plate, exposing a second core that pulsed with the same light. Lu coordinated perfectly as well, his concentrated sonic roar destroying armor in a third location. The sound was focused like a laser, creating destructive resonance frequencies that made the creature's protective plating crack and crumble. Zhao launched more feathers that destroyed both exposed cores almost simultaneously. The creature's organic systems began cascading failure, But it still wasn't enough to bring down something of this magnitude. Taro, Mako, and Shizu worked in coordination to keep the beast's legs almost immobile. Earth pillars emerged from the ground, gripping the abomination's extremities and holding in position so attacks could continue with precision rather than desperation. But after this first partial victory, when 3 cores had been destroyed, the monster finally revealed its secret weapon. The same defense that had prevented Julius from doing anything effective during his first encounter with similar creatures activated now. A massive wave of lesser mutant beasts emerged from tunnels that opened spontaneously around the combat area. Dozens, then hundreds of creatures headed directly toward the group, threatening to overwhelm them through pure quantity rather than individual strength. Use the full fusions. Julius shouted above the roar of the approaching horde. Things are going to get much worse. The air immediately filled with transformative energy as each group member except Ron and the guards activated their maximum fusions. They knew they had minutes, maybe less, before exhaustion left them vulnerable to counterattack. But they also had only this opportunity to destroy enough cores before being completely overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of secondary enemies. Luna crouched low, observing patrol patterns she had memorized during years of formal visits to the castle. At her side, Leora trembled slightly, not from fear, but from amusement at playing spy again, the thrill of forbidden adventure making her eyes bright with excitement. All of them wore artifacts and hoods to conceal their mana signatures. "This is madness," Matilda murmured, her voice barely above a whisper as she pressed against the stone wall. "If they discover us, they're going to—" "They won't discover us if you shut up," Luna responded with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning the castle's hidden spaces. "I know the service routes better than the guards themselves, thanks to our old adventures with Larissa." Lady Luna, escaping from the academy, was already serious enough. Now, infiltrating the castle during a crisis, Kira began. "I don't want to hear it," Luna interrupted, her tone carrying the finality of someone who had moved beyond argument. "You lost and agreed to be obedient, so we would let you follow us, remember?" Kira, who still had a red nose from their earlier confrontation, sighed and pointed toward a section of the wall where shadows created natural concealment. "Ah, the blind spot between the guard towers that we used 4 years ago. We can climb through that space if we still fit." Leora analyzed with a fast assessment of someone who had spent years learning mischief. "Are you sure Larissa will help us?" Mayo asked while they prepared to move, her voice carrying some concern beneath her usual sharp demeanor. "After what happened with Ron, SS novel fired net." Luna stopped, unconsciously touching her lips with one finger, a gesture so brief she might not have been aware of it. She pulled her hand away quickly to speak. "Larissa has ways to access official seals and knows almost all the procedures. Although you're right that we haven't been able to mention anything about Ron when visiting her for a long time." Her voice became softer, carrying understanding. "Even so, I think she'll help me. If anyone understands what it's like to live with guilt over decisions that affected others, it's her." They waited until the patrol passed, then moved like shadows toward the wall. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and they would be spotted in the open. Too late, and the next patrol would catch them climbing. Luna was the first to scale, if you could call it scaling when she simply jumped between shadows created by the proximity of the two structures. One by one, the others followed her path. Once on the desired floor, Luna guided them through service passages she had explored during visits from her earliest childhood. Corridors that connected the kitchens to the main quarters, routes designed for servants to move invisibly through the castle's daily operations. "Larissa's quarters are close," she whispered while they moved through a barely illuminated corridor that smelled of old stone and recent cleaning. The sound of footsteps made them freeze. Luna gestured for them to hide in a niche while a servant passed carrying urgent documents related to the crisis. When the hallway was empty again, they resumed their advance with even greater caution. "We're almost there," Luna murmured when she recognized the characteristic decorations of the wing where Larissa's quarters were located. But before reaching the door, the sound of familiar footsteps made them hide again. Larissa's strict tutor was walking in their direction, carrying some books and scrolls with the measured pace of someone who took her educational responsibilities seriously. Luna urgently gestured for everyone to hide in the nearest niche again, pressing harder against the cold stone wall. The footsteps approached, paused and deliberate. The tutor stopped just before passing where they were hidden, as if some instinct had warned her of something amiss. Luna tensed her muscles, mentally preparing to have to knock out another person if necessary. Chapter 583, Taming the Fourth Year, Journey, Struggle, 2. A moment of tension stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Then the tutor whispered, without turning toward the niche where they were hiding. Larissa needs her friends now. Enough of suffering alone. The girls exchanged looks of silent shock. The tutor knew they were there? Had their infiltration been compromised, or was this something else entirely? The answer, perhaps going out to get some sun and see the world she's missing would help her. The woman continued in the same low tone, her voice seeming worried for that someone who had withdrawn too far into herself. Though not too far, because of the crisis and all that. She made a significant pause. Then again, the tower roof is always free at these hours. The views of the city and its academies are educational. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the hallway. The tutor never turned toward where they were hidden, maintaining the fiction that she hadn't felt anything. Her discretion was a gift wrapped in plausible deniability. Luna waited until the footsteps faded completely before emerging from the niche. Her muscles cramped from the tension of forced stillness and worry. For original chapters, go to novelfur.net. Do you think it's a trap? Leora whispered, her voice barely audible as she scanned the empty corridor for signs of approaching guards. Umi shook her head slowly. Her voice, it sounded genuinely worried about Larissa. Luna approached Larissa's chamber door, processing what had just happened. The tutor had had the perfect opportunity to maybe scream and alert the guards, to end their infiltration before it could accomplish anything. Instead, she had offered useful information and a way to approach their friend, without any confrontation. At least now we know we're not the only ones who need help. Leora murmured while stepping forward before Luna and placed her hand on the door handle. Julius's energy exploded like an Earth supernova. Enormous walls grew instantaneously around the combat area, their surfaces covered with spikes that moved like they were living entities. Tons of earth and stone reshaping themselves, but not according to his will. He wasn't controlling the individual movement of the spikes. His control was enormous, but not to that point. However, he wasn't alone. His duplicated beast was the one who manipulated these formations with great power and speed, making them grow and shrink in rhythmic waves that punctured any mutant creature attempting to cross the impromptu barrier. The coordination between Tamer and Beast created a defensive system that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. My fusion won't last much longer, Julius shouted while maintaining his massive earth control, sweat streaming down his face as the strain of channeling such enormous power took its toll. Let's finish the fight now and prepare to flee from the wave. His control was enormous, but he could also feel energy draining at an alarming rate. Each meter wall expansion outward, and each wave of spikes required more concentration. Each adjustment in the walls demanded more power. It was like conducting a symphony while lifting mountains. Lou immediately coordinated with his duplicated beast too. Devastating sound waves emerged from 2 points simultaneously, creating a destructive interference that amplified the damage exponentially. The waves found resonances in the abomination structure, causing multiple sections to crack and fragment at the same time. Taro and his duplicated beast suppressed the leg movements alone as they surpassed the previous control that the two guards had helped maintain. With Mako switching to using her evolved ambusher to harden the earth, Taro controlled even further. The stability of his formations multiplied exponentially. Shizu took advantage of being freed from suppressive responsibilities to go completely on the attack. Her enormous Earth Wolverine now the same size and rank as Julius's, destroying already damaged plates with brutal assaults. Zhao maintained his assault of feathers with incredible power, speed, and precision at each core that was exposed by Shizu's attacks, taking advantage of the cracks from Lu's sonic blows and the holes created by Ren's attacks. His marksmanship was legendary for good reason. Every projectile found its mark without fail, threading even through the defensive gaps that existed for mere fractions of a second. And while he concentrated on the main mutation, his duplicated beast, the owl raptor with hardened feathers sharp as blades, flew high to circle Julius's wall and systematically eliminate the few mutations that managed to overcome the waves of spikes. The owl raptor spun in the air at enormous speeds, its wings cutting through the wind, while keeping at bay what looked like a growing tide of horrible beasts constantly emerging from more and more underground tunnels. Min maintained a defensive position, conserving what little energy he had left for medical emergencies. Ren maintained constant offense, but still avoided using his complete fusion since at Julius and Zhao's request he would be part of the evacuation effort at the end. However, his attack still gradually gained power as the corrupt roots in his system tried to grow, but this time he had much more control, channeling that energy into his elemental techniques instead of allowing it to spread uncontrollably. The sensation was like what riding a lightning bolt would figuratively be, dangerous but exhilarating when properly directed. The enormous beast tried to cover itself, repositioning its protective plates and using the arm claw to block attacks directed at its cores. But faced with the joint and coordinated assault, it couldn't completely hide its vulnerable points from so many angles. Core after core disintegrated under Zhao's precision and the exposure created by the group effort. The organic systems connecting the sphere on its back began failing completely, creating additional weak points that the team exploited immediately. Each destroyed core sent ripples of system failure through the creature's hybrid body, like watching a complex machine shut down piece by piece. But a cornered beast is still dangerous. Desperate in the face of a battle, it was clearly losing. The abomination decided to use its last card. It coiled in on itself, even breaking its legs against Taro's and Mako's control, and began directing what remained of its light to the sphere it was connected with. The claw on its back began overcharging with energy, absorbing power not only from the remaining cores, but also from the organic systems that kept the creature functional. Its light veins tone changed from corrupt violet to a brilliant pink that hurt to look at directly. The huge arm rose as its wrinkled and dry wooden form transformed into something smoother and newer, as if recovering a long-lost original appearance. The change was like watching time reverse, revealing what the ancient artifact had been before time weakened it. The attack came fast and unexpected. From the palm of the new claw tree emerged a pulse of pure energy that threatened to strike the entire team simultaneously. Mako's evolved golden ambusher, which was closest hitting and breaking the enemy's plates with its claws, was the first to be reached. The creature simply disappeared, vaporized instantly by the wave of force. There was no dramatic death scene. One moment existed. The next it was gone, leaving only the echo of its final roar. The loss of connection knocked the tamer unconscious immediately. "Mako!" Shizu screamed, but there was no time to process the loss. Zhao's owl raptor rose desperately, its wings beating with maximum force to gain altitude. It managed to avoid the worst of the glow, though the feathers on its tail were singed by proximity to energies that could unmake itself. But those on the ground had nowhere to escape. The pulse expanded like a wave of destruction that promised to annihilate everything in its path. "Down!" Taro roared with desperate determination. Julius, Ren, Taro, and Shizu activated Earth control simultaneously, channeling their energy as quickly as possible into creating thick and resistant defensive formations. Layers upon layers of hardened stone rose between them and the destructive wave. The formations cracked immediately under the assault. The first layer disintegrated like sand before a hurricane. The second fragmented into thousands of pieces. The third absorbed part of the impact, but collapsed with a groaning protest of matter pushed beyond its limits. The battlefield remained silent for a moment. It seemed things had taken a terrible turn, but everyone was miraculously alive. The worst of the attack had been absorbed by their desperate defense. From the debris of the destroyed defenses, Ren emerged first in a furious explosion of rocks, his jade scales brighter than before. Zhao and Julius also launched into attack, their bodies bruised but operational. Without verbal communication, the three understood this was a decisive moment. Zhao launched his last feathers before positioning himself in a perfect line with his raptor in the air, executing his most powerful signature movement, all feathers directed toward the cores that had been exposed when the abomination had drained energy for its desperate attack. Julius stopped expanding the walls for his own final attack and channeled his last reserves into a mineral assault just below the connection with the sphere, destroying the creature's remaining defenses. Ren, feeling the black roots pulsing with more and more accumulated energy, channeled them completely into a concentrated ray that pierced directly to the beast's last central core. The combined impact was devastating. The abomination emitted an agonizing shriek that resonated to the impromptu bowl, a cry that signaled something fundamental in the creature being destroyed. The sound was not just heard but felt, vibrating through bone and soul with the finality of absolute ending. Then, the creature began to dissolve. Its body mass disintegrated like mist, the organic systems evaporating into violet vapor that smelled of corruption. In moments, all that remained was the enormous claw arm, now wrinkled again and motionless on the ground like a winning monument to a battle that had pushed everyone to the limit of their capabilities. The silence that followed was broken only by heavy breathing and the distant sound of some remaining minor mutants still insisting on scaling the wall with the mindless persistence of corrupted minions. "Is it over?" men asked, approaching cautiously to examine injuries. Chapter 584, Taming the Fourth Year, Journey Struggle 3. Had Min ruined everything with his innocent question about whether it was all over? No, it surely was nothing more than coincidence. But the arm claw began pulsing with renewed intensity just after his words. The mutant creatures that had already been advancing aggressively worsened. Their movements became even more aggressive, more intense, as if something had enraged them beyond their already considerable fury. "The big creature no longer controls them," Lou observed while leaning heavily on Taro, his voice strained from exhaustion. "But the artifact is definitely still a problem." Zhao attempted to launch some feathers toward the pulsing arm, taking advantage of his remaining fusion power, but again they bounced harmlessly against its surface. The ancient construction seemed to mock their efforts. Julius also tried attacks with his most powerful minerals, but the ancient structure absorbed the impact without showing the least damage. "We can't affect it with normal attacks," Julius murmured, rapidly evaluating their limited options while watching the creature tide grow larger. "And we don't have energy for prolonged attempts." "Then we only can escape," Zhao declared pragmatically, though his voice carried the frustration of leaving an unsolved problem that would likely claim lives later. But Rin still hadn't given up like the others. The purified roots in his system, those that had been cleansed by Sirius's attack but not completely eliminated, began feeling more energized in a different way. His system had expanded again, but it wasn't like the uncontrolled corruption from before. Instead, it was something calmer, more controllable. Perhaps now he could understand it. "Run," Julius called when he noticed him advancing toward the center of the bowl. "We don't have time for experiments." "I can feel something," Rin responded, approaching the pulsing artifact. "My system is reacting, as if it recognizes the energy." Zhao and Julius exchanged worried glances, but positioned themselves to resist the growing advance of creatures, clearly reluctant to stay there with so little energy, but trusting that Rin was about to discover something crucial. Rin hurried and, ignoring his companion's protests, extended his hand toward the armed surface. The contact released an immediate and intense flow of information. He could feel a bit of the artifact's intricate construction through energy that was like his own, but also contrary by nature. The patterns were complex, layers upon layers of purposes he couldn't completely decipher. Maybe if his fungus were here to provide the deep understanding he needed, but he couldn't lament what he had lost or what he didn't have now. There was no time for subtleties or complete comprehension, so he decided to use brute force. He channeled a good part of the purified energy he had available directly into the artifact, trying to overwhelm whatever corruption had taken hold of its original systems. An intense effort, and then a small section of the artifact went dark, the corrupt energy visibly cleansing like ink being washed from a surface. For a moment, Rin felt hope that he could purify the entire structure, that his sacrifice of power could be worthwhile. Then there was a rebound of corrupt energy in the artifact, and a wave traveled to the ground and environment in response to his interference. The mutant creatures stopped completely, as if they had received a silent signal. Then, with an almost maddened intensity they hadn't shown before, they became much more aggressive and desperate. Their movements lost all semblance of natural behavior, becoming deranged. "Run!" Julius shouted while a wave of mutants climbed to the top and began directing themselves toward them. "There's no more time. Leave that thing and let's go." Zhao added, his wings extended in preparation for retreat. Yet, Rin forced himself to maintain contact with the artifact, trying to concentrate more power into purification. If he fused and used all his power, maybe. But before he could fuse to concentrate significantly more energy, a new energy signature was felt alarmingly close. From the earth emerged another enormous abomination. This one wasn't connected to an arm like the previous one. Instead, what was emerging seemed to be a leg. Rin couldn't be completely sure from his angle, but the extremity was massive and clearly made of the same material as the arm, fused with organic technology in the same horrifying way as the previous one. Rin couldn't know for certain, but in this zone there hadn't been one, but two caves. One was the one his father had found first, and where Ron had come repeatedly with his fungus. That was different. Rin had taken a detour in his first exploration and found a divergent small vein. Follow current S on N, velfire.net. This new artifact belonged to his father's first cave and had been buried much deeper than the first, connected to the second vein that his father had mentioned casually in his stories. And now it was also corrupted, also converted into the core of an abomination. How many of these artifacts are there? Rin murmured, horror growing in his chest. The new abomination was just as massive as the first, its movements causing tremors in the ground. Without energy for another prolonged battle, the group faced an impossible situation. We have to open a tunnel in the walls. Julius shouted, pointing toward a side where his previous defenses still partially stood, and pushed by brute force through one side of the creature waved to escape. The main danger is a new abomination, Zhao added while calculating paths. It can send the small creatures directly toward us. Rin had to give up on his initial objective again, understanding his friends' and allies' situation. Being caught between a massive new threat and hundreds of lesser mutants would be fatal in their current state. He summoned his Wolverine from his dimensional space, the massive beast appearing with its jaws open and ready to serve as both transport and protection. "Carry those who can't move fast," he ordered while helping unconscious Mako onto the beast, followed by Lu and Taro, who were struggling to maintain balance after the energy expenditure of the previous battle. The fusions were canceled for everyone except Julius and Zhao, who maintained theirs through pure stubbornness, and with the help of healing touches that Min managed between his own fatigue to clear a path between the mutant beasts. Julius opened a cave on one side of his walls, and Zhao maintained elimination of beasts at the front and back, his attacks precise despite the exhaustion that made his hands tremble. Everyone was at their limit when they barely managed to escape, heading toward the city while the sound of thousands of paws echoed behind them like the drumbeat of approaching doom. Rin looked back from his Wolverine's back while they put distance between themselves and the nightmare they had left behind. The walls Julius had erected collapsed under combined assault of hundreds of mutants and the new massive abomination. The creatures surrounded the enormous arm artifact like pilgrims worshipping at some unholy shrine. The creatures began molding themselves with horrible cracking sounds and wet tearing and popping noises, joining into an enormous mass that connected to the sphere at the arm's base. And then, as if responding to their devotion, light returned to the artifact. It began to move again, its massive fingers flexing with new life. The systems reactivated, and the corruption Rin had managed to cleanse began returning, spreading like infection to the small purified section. With the help of the energy and shrieks of the large creature, the new mass began taking shape into a new large abomination. "The city's defense," Rin murmured, understanding dawning horribly in his mind, "is far from over." Chapter 585, Taming the Fourth Year, Sharing Pain. Leora pushed open the door and entered Larissa's quarters, followed by Luna and the others. The room was enormous, decorated with embroidered tapestries and furniture made from slightly gleaming exotic woods that corresponded to a noble of her rank. But there was something in the atmosphere that felt heavy, charged with a sadness that no expensive decoration could disguise. Newest update provided by velfire.net. Larissa was seated at an ornate desk near the window, bent over mathematics exercises and political theory that clearly weren't helping her distract herself as her tutor had hoped. The papers were scattered carelessly, ink blots marking where her attention had wandered, equations half-finished and abandoned. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and when she heard the door open, she hurried to dry her eyes with the sleeve of her dress, try and compose a more appropriate expression. It had been some time since the girls had all seen each other together. The last times they had visited Larissa were during school vacations, since she no longer attended the normal academy like the others, having changed to this private education in the castle with Victor's permission. That separation had created a small distance between them, an invisible gap that hadn't existed when they saw each other constantly. The bonds of daily friendship had been replaced by the more formal rhythms of scheduled visits and carefully planned conversations. "Larissa!" Leora exclaimed, approaching with the social energy that characterized her. For her, visits to the castle during her first 10 years of life with Selphra as tutor had been abundant, so she felt comfortable in the place. The months of separation always vanished as if they hadn't passed, and she immediately felt casual and comfortable. Larissa tried vainly to hide her emotional state. Her eyes were red and swollen, with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. No matter how much she tried to smile convincingly, it was obvious she had been crying recently. "Girls, I wasn't expecting you," she murmured, trying to reorganize the papers in front of her to appear busy with important tasks instead of simply trying not to fall apart. At that moment, Maria emerged from a corner of the enormous room, where she had apparently been organizing some things in a tall wardrobe. Her eyes lit up upon seeing the visitors, bringing genuine warmth to the heavy atmosphere. "Girls," she greeted with honest joy, addressing especially Mayo and Matilda, "what pleasant surprise to see you here so soon." As co-workers in service, Maria got along very well with the other maids of the princesses from important families and had developed particular camaraderie with them. She missed them considerably, having had to leave the academy and follow Larissa into the more isolated world of castle service. But falling back into awareness of Larissa's present situation, she approached with an expression of joy that quickly changed to one of maternal concern. "Larissa is a bit indisposed today," Maria explained with diplomatic tact, subtly gesturing toward her mistress's abandoned exercises. "We had no knowledge that you would be visiting. Can you give her a moment to prepare herself?" Mayo, never one to avoid direct truth even in delicate situations, scoffed gently but not cruelly. "Maria, read the room. It's obvious we're here unexpectedly because we need something urgent, not because we have free time for social visits." She gestured toward their slightly disheveled clothing and the tense expressions of all the girls. If this were a normal visit, we would have even sent a letter in advance. Larissa, still partially covering her face with her hands, looked up with some curiosity, but mixed with caution. "What kind of help do you need?" she asked, her voice betraying both that small interest and an instinctive fear of involving herself in outside matters that would generate more emotional complications. Leora began explaining the situation, but did so in a partial and indirect way, trying to be diplomatic about the complicated political crisis the Starweavers faced. She spoke vaguely about family problems, documents that might be needed to protect legitimate interests, situations requiring certain creative flexibility in normal bureaucratic procedures. "It's complicated to explain all the details," Leora murmured, gesturing nervously. "But basically we need access to official documentation that allows us to access rewards and power for completing tasks that normally wouldn't be available to people our age." After hearing the vague explanations, Larissa sighed deeply, her expression becoming more distant and formal. "Arturo is extremely busy with the current defense crisis," she responded, her tone adopting the protective formality she had learned to use when she didn't want to deal with complicated situations. "He's not going to tolerate any type of bureaucratic games right now, especially not with the castle completely upside down because of the situation that seems to be outside." She paused, looking toward the window where they could hear people moving with urgency. "I think it would be much better if you forget all this. Hide for a while until things calm down, and then return discreetly to the academy before the authorities realize you escaped." Her voice softened slightly, showing the genuine affection she felt for her friends despite her reluctance to get involved. "But I sincerely appreciate that you came to see me. You managed to distract me for a while, and that means more than you can imagine." Leora didn't completely understand Larissa's defensive reaction or the reasons behind her resistance to helping with something that normally would have seemed like an interesting and fun challenge to her. But she didn't get upset, nor did she give up completely. She approached with intention to offer comfort and put an understanding hand on her shoulder. "Larissa, I don't think you completely understand the gravity of what's happening. Luna's political situation is genuinely serious and desperate, and we thought maybe you would understand. And since you have access to resources that..." She began speaking more rapidly, tried to explain in greater detail the crisis the Starweavers faced and the political maneuvers of Luna's uncles. But before she could continue, Luna gave her a soft but firm hit on the head and gently moved her aside with determined movements. Without saying a single word of explanation, Luna approached Larissa directly and enveloped her in a strong and sincere embrace. Larissa remained completely motionless for a moment, genuinely confused by the sudden demonstration of physical affection. The action took her by complete surprise, since Luna normally wasn't so direct with emotional demonstrations. But after a few seconds of shock and the warm sensation of a loving embrace, something inside her broke like a dam that had been containing too much pressure for too long. She began crying openly, without trying to hide or control it. Mayo whispered discreetly to the 4 guards who had remained respectfully near the entrance, observing the scene with expressions of concern. It's really strange to see Luna demonstrate more emotional intelligence and be more emotionally daring than Leora. She paused, observing how Luna held Larissa's back and head in her hug while she cried. But I suppose it must be because they're both suffering quite a bit right now. Maybe shared pain creates understanding that words can't achieve. Umi nodded discreetly, having closely observed the dramatic change in Luna's personality since she had made the desperate decision to escape from the academy and physically confront her own guards. The old guards that trained her were right. Growth came through crisis rather than comfort. Chapter 586, Taming the Swarm. After several minutes, where Larissa simply allowed herself to cry without restrictions in Luna's arms, the latter began speaking to her in a low and soft voice. With what seemed like emotional maturity she had suddenly developed. "Larissa," Luna murmured, her voice loaded with an understanding that came from recent personal experience. "I understand your situation. I understand your loss." She tightened the embrace slightly, as if trying to anchor them both against the storms they were weathering individually. "I know you don't like talking about what happened. I know it's incredibly painful to relive it. Right now, I think I feel very similar to how you've been feeling." Her own voice began breaking slightly with emotion. "I lost something just as important as what you lost. And my family, their future, everything is at risk right now. So I desperately need to try to recover what little I can." Luna separated just enough to be able to look directly into Larissa's swollen eyes. "It's time for you to overcome the suffering. Face it, and try to recover what little you can too. Even he..." Her voice became firmer, referring to Rindo consciously avoiding mentioning his name, "has been trying to recover it too. He's been fighting constantly to find ways to heal the damage like a madman." She embraced her again, stronger this time, as if she could transfer strength and determination through direct physical contact. "So again, I think it's time for both of us to stop simply crying for what we lost and start helping each other recover what we can. It's time to do something instead of just suffering in silence." The enormous room remained in complete silence for a moment, while the other girls waited patiently to see how Larissa would respond. Larissa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but this time didn't try to hide the fact that she had been crying or pretend she was completely composed. "How much do I need to do so you can manage to confront them?" she finally asked, her voice still shaky but with new intention that hadn't been present in years. Luna smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the expression reached her eyes. "I need something like a legal loophole to have official documents that give validity to achievements earned by minors useful during family crises. Something with enough bureaucratic weight to counteract the political power my uncles are accumulating while my father is gone." She paused, organizing her thoughts carefully. "And I think you know exactly what type of documents can achieve that, and more importantly, how to get them without having to go through normal bureaucratic channels that would automatically disqualify us due to our age." Larissa considered the request for a long moment, her mind already beginning to work through the specific possibilities. That could work," she murmured slowly, her voice carrying the first notes of genuine interest. "But achieving it would be extremely risky." For the first time in many months of pure and unproductive pain, Larissa felt something that wasn't simply suffering. She felt purpose, direction, and the possibility that her time could be transformed into constructive action. Maria observed from her position, a small but genuine smile appearing on her face, as she watched her mistress begin to recover something of the determination she had lost. The maid had witnessed too many days of listless grief not to recognize the significance of this moment. Larissa straightened up more, her mind beginning to work through legal possibilities with sharp focus. Updates are released by novel FireNet. There are some exceptions in the protocols that could work, she murmured, organizing her thoughts while speaking. At any moment of crisis, protocols normally exclude non-combatant people from participating directly in battle. She stood and began walking toward a bookshelf full of legal codes. But it's a system designed to save communities that would only be helpless victims, not to prevent valuable contributions. The purpose is to protect, not to limit. She pulled out a thick tome and began leafing through it with familiarity born of months of intensive legal education. In heroic cases of youth and weak victims who were cornered by circumstances, official recognitions have been given to those who acted to defend or attack in cases necessary for survival. Luna approached, her interest genuinely awakened by the possibility of finding a solution. So there are legal precedents? Asked Leora. Yes, in theory, Larissa nodded, finding the pages she was looking for. We can probably circumvent many of the normal requirements for being called to fight with the right arguments. If you achieve something significant during crisis... She stopped, her expression becoming more somber as the full implications became clear. The problem is that a truly large crisis that affects the entire city and merits substantial recognition doesn't present itself easily. And it's not like we want to have one. Leora frowned. What type of crisis would be sufficient? Outside of long-range military operations with thousands of soldiers involved, Larissa explained, Luna can't do much with the underground attacks. They're already being systematically controlled by established noble families. They have almost all the resources. Matilda approached the window, observing patrols moving with increasing urgency through the castle courtyards. Well, things look pretty difficult outside, as if destiny had been listening to their conversation. The city's alarms intensified dramatically. The sound changed from routine warnings of defensive shift changes to genuine emergency signals that penetrated even the thick castle walls. The transformation was unmistakable. This was no longer a minor threat. What's happening? Mayo murmured, also approaching the window with growing concern. They could see much more frantic movements in the castle courtyards, soldiers running desperate and messengers arriving with alarming frequency. The organized calm of normal CSSO, corrupted beast sporadic swarm defense operations had given way to the chaos of genuine crisis. It seems the attack on the city materialized with much more force than anticipated, Luna observed, feeling both terror and opportunity that made her pulse quicken. Destiny put us right at the beginning of a crisis, so we could act. It wasn't really the case, of course. It was just extraordinary coincidence, false circumstantial evidence, but it generated the perfect situation for their needs. It fit them like a glove, exactly as they had needed. This is our opportunity, Larissa declared. If we're going to do something, it has to be now. While the girls rushed to prepare their bureaucratic maneuvers, and Ren was still traveling with Julius before facing the first giant creature, the city was being attacked by the first massive wave of mutants. Selpher found herself on the main wall alongside Victor, both coordinating the defensive response to corrupt beasts, the largest they had had to organize in decades. And it wasn't just that there were more of them. Now, they were also updated to their version 2.0, more difficult to eliminate and without elemental weaknesses like the common ones. We need a wall, Selpher shouted, extending her hands while channeling massive elemental power. Beside her, Victor did the same, and between the two, they began generating a barrier of ice and minerals that rose like an artificial mountain around the side of the city. Selpher's ice provided most of the instantaneous structure, while Victor's minerals reinforced it at key points with the option of function as the base of a new wall with long-term durability. They had received Julius's first message some time before, and had managed to control the first 2 lines of minor abominations with relative efficiency. But then additional messages arrived that completely changed the nature of the crisis. A 3rd line of abominations had caused devastating chaos in Yino, the settlement on the other side of their new territory. Since the vast majority of inhabitants in that area were below silver rank and hadn't benefited from the updated information run had provided about cultivation techniques, the residents had suffered considerably. Their impromptu resistance had been barely sufficient to initiate a desperate evacuation toward the defended side of the main city. Selphra and Victor couldn't know it, but things were going to get even worse. Chapter 587, Taming the Swarm 2. The non-combatant people of Yino weren't mostly to blame for the past war, so letting them die would be unjust in both leaders' opinion. These were civilians whose only crime had been living in the wrong place when corruption decided to awaken. "We have to split up," Victor decided, rapidly evaluating the situation while watching smoke rise from multiple directions. "I'll go to Yino's side with part of the army to stop the creatures there." Selphra nodded, though she could see the strain this would put on both forces. Dividing their resources felt like trying to dam two rivers with half the stones needed for one. "Distribute the Earth Tamers well. We're going to need to close all possible entrances and defend the city with a complete external circular wall," she murmured, calculating the energy that would be required for such an ambitious defensive structure. At first, everything went well. The efforts to keep the cities underground defended already had thousands of Earth Tamers mobilized who stayed active in rotating shifts. Now, they would have to work 16 hours instead of 8, but with a little more pressure, the number of defenders could increase by adding thousands from the Abyss Wall, and thousands more who weren't participating. The opportunistic noble families had many of those on standby, waiting for a specific signal before committing their resources. But while Selphra and Victor built defenses and managed to stop the initial advance of creatures, a fourth line of mutants arrived at Selphra's side of the wall from Starweaver territory. This was a line that not even Run had had time to sense during his current battle, emerging from a completely unexpected direction. Their defensive planning became exponentially more complex. "Damn!" Selphra shouted while reinforcing a section that should have been covered by Sirius's family and had begun cracking under the assault. "Where are so many vermin coming from?" Victor, who had reached Yino's side with part of his forces, found himself also facing no longer just one flow of creatures, but two simultaneous flows converging on the same area. The situation was much worse than the scouts had reported, and the refugees were caught in the crossfire, with the flow from the side where Run was fighting, which would undoubtedly increase when they retreated due to the new artifact they had discovered. The cities were about to find themselves completely besieged by 6 different flows of mutant creatures. And maybe they weren't yet all the flows they would face. Did all these flows originate from different artifacts? How many artifacts were scattered around the kingdom? Their soldiers were being dispersed in a narrow line around the cities, and were therefore being pushed backward despite their best efforts. The refugees from Yino kept arriving in numbers that strained their logistical capabilities beyond reasonable limits. Selphra made the decision to extend her side of the wall even more, using energy reserves she knew she could maintain indefinitely. Now, even the new doubles and most gold ranks in Selphra and Dravenholm power were spread thin. How many more going to appear? She wondered while reinforcing another section of the wall that had begun to crack under sustained assault. The defenses were covering 6 different flows when Selphra received the report she had been dreading. A messenger arrived flying. His breathing labored from urgency and the strain of maintaining high flight speed over long distances. "Matriarch!" he shouted while approaching where she maintained control of the ice wall. 2 more flows have emerged from Yino's side. Selphra felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. 8 flows were already stretching their defenses to the absolute limit. The forces they had available were distributed so widely along the city's circumference that each section barely had minimum coverage. "Status of other positions?" she asked, though she feared the answer would only bring more bad news. "Victor reports he urgently needs reinforcements in Yino," the messenger responded, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had witnessed a deteriorating situation firsthand. "The first 2 flows on his side have intensified, and the other 2 are pushing toward the city center near the evacuation. Some refugee families are trapped." Another messenger arrived before she could completely process the previous information. "Matriarch, the southern wall in the ex-Goldcrest territory shows significant cracks. 2 lines of creatures are concentrating their attacks on that point." Selphra looked toward the horizon, where she could see smoke rising from multiple directions. The scope of the crisis was becoming clearer with each passing moment, and it was larger than anything they had expected. "How many non-combatant worker families do we still have within the outermost perimeter?" she asked her second-in-command. Approximately 3,000, matriarch. The Iron and Bronze Zone. Children, elderly, workers like artisans, farmers, minor merchants. There were many people who couldn't defend themselves if silver rank power level creatures penetrated the defenses. If she allowed the defenses to fail, they wouldn't be talking about some military casualties. They would be talking about a massacre of helpless civilians. Selphra closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of a decision she had been avoiding by abusing her own power. The order she didn't want to give. The order that would open doors to political complications that could last years. But the alternative was much worse. Newest update provided by NovelFire.net. Give the general crisis signal with my ice seal, she finally ordered, her voice loaded with resignation and resolution mixed together. Her second-in-command looked at her with surprise. Matriarch, are you sure? Once declared. I know perfectly well, Selphra interrupted him. But soon the battle is going to enter the city if we don't get more forces. It doesn't matter where they come from. The General Crisis Signal was a protocol with far-reaching implications. It officially declared that the city's regular forces couldn't contain a threat alone, opening the stage for support from all inhabitants and, more significantly, legitimizing important achievements that would normally be restricted to active military personnel. It was exactly what families like the Starweaver faction opposed to Sirius, the Ashenway opposed to Selphra, or the remnant of the Goldcrest Zone would need to claim political recognition. In the war a few years ago, the same space opened up, Selphra murmured while an assistant prepared the visual signals that would rise from all the city's towers. But many of those families sat on their hands because they weren't sure who would win the conflict. She remembered vividly how the varied interests in that war's resolution had paralyzed many noble houses, each one waiting to see which way the winds blew before committing their resources. But in this case, she continued, observing the smoke rising from multiple battle points, I'm sure they won't hesitate. The new vault under the castle and its immense wealth was in the sights of all the kingdom's prominent families. Any achievement during this crisis would be a perfect excuse to demand parts of that wealth, and with those resources they could dramatically increase both the quality and number of their private soldiers. It wasn't pleasant to think about how annoying and shameless they would be in their subsequent demands, but unfortunately those additional military resources were now absolutely necessary. The political price of survival was always paid later, but death collected its debts immediately. Chapter 588, Taming the Swarm, 3. Purple banners began rising from each tower of the city, visible from kilometers away like beacons of desperation cutting through the smoky air. They were followed by flashes of light. The visual display was a formal acknowledgement. Almost immediately, Selphra could feel changes in the political dynamics of the city. She knew that in mansions and castles throughout the territory, noble families were rapidly evaluating what resources they could mobilize and what achievements they could claim. The General Crisis Declaration had opened doors that would be impossible to close once the immediate threat passed. A new messenger arrived from the castle's direction, his mount breathing heavily from the urgent flight across the city's chaotic landscape. Matriarch, report from the main castle. Several minor families have begun mobilizing forces. There are also reports that some groups are requesting permission for direct actions outside the wall and in Yino. Selphra felt a mixture of hope and concern while observing the tactical movements beginning to deploy, though she noticed something that disturbed her deeply. The Starweaver Zone wasn't being defended by the Starweavers themselves. Selphra had assumed they would do something like this, but seeing it happen affected her mood more than she had anticipated. The political maneuvering was beginning even as civilians on the Yino side died, and the cynicism of it left a bitter taste that had nothing to do with the smoke-filled air. Instead of protecting their own territory, they were directing themselves to Yino that was closer to the Goldcrest side, making the march longer just to cross-support with other families. Meanwhile, forces from Goldcrest territory were heading far too, to the abandoned Starweaver territory. Selphra realized fast why this was the case. It was a calculated movement that exploited legal loopholes in antiquated rules. The regulations allowed families to claim achievements for defending territories that had been abandoned in crisis, regardless of whether the abandonment had been strategic. In this case, they sought to further damage Sirius's low standing as their leader, since he, who had left to seek a solution, and whose territory could be considered abandoned in a certain bureaucratic sense, couldn't react to it. Selfer immediately realized what they were doing in collusion with the ex-Goldcrest territory families to gain more weight in their future recognition claims. By not defending a territory that bore their same surname, even though it was part of another faction's territory within their family, it wouldn't be easy to argue it had been their obligation from the beginning. These types of loopholes she could see now during a crisis showed her these were rules that should definitely be corrected, but now that she saw how they would be used, it was too late to do anything about it. It was always like this in her experience. Humans tended to react after accidents happened, not before. Follow current novels on NOVL_fire.net. But there was nothing to do now, since Targaryen wasn't present to enforce fairer protocols. So she would have to let these political maneuvers pass. The important thing was the military support they would provide, and that it arrives quickly, regardless of the political motivations behind it. Even within her own family, some parts more distant from her direct control, and family branches that had disagreed with her policies, with various stubborn elders leading factions, were going to want to make similar moves to maximize their own benefits. So this time Selfer didn't blame the individual players, but the game, the complete system. Rules designed to be manipulated by those with sufficient legal knowledge and resources to exploit their weaknesses. It was a bitter reflection to have in the middle of a genuine crisis. But the crisis itself was revealing just how old and broken their political structure had become. In the castle, Luna, Leora, and Larissa had finally managed to gather all the necessary documents. An hour of meticulous work with legal codes and historical precedents had produced a complete set of paperwork that would, technically, legitimize Luna's actions during crisis. The documents were spread across Larissa's desk like a battle plan drawn in ink and legal terminology, each piece carefully crafted to exploit the same kind of bureaucratic loopholes the noble families were using outside. "We only need one more thing," Larissa murmured, studying the documents with the focused attention of someone who had spent years learning to navigate legal complexities. "What?" Luna asked, hoping it wouldn't be something impossible to obtain. "A seal issued by the royal family. Specifically, we need to activate this official seal." Larissa drew out an ornate medallion. It was clearly an artifact of authority, designed to authenticate documents of importance. But it can only be activated by a royal with stronger control from a gold-ranked Chelan. Leora frowned, her mind immediately working through potential solutions. "Can it be any Earth control? Doesn't your fairy? I'm a royal and have Earth control, but my silver-ranked fairy is dual element and doesn't have control at that level," Larissa explained. "Her specialization is more directed toward pure minerals and light manipulation. It's very different from the raw Earth control that's needed." She sat heavily, clearly frustrated but strangely smiling. Women in royalty generally don't have Chelans. At least it's extremely rare in the kingdom's history. "Why?" Matilda asked, who had been listening from near the door with growing concern about their plan. "Power gatekeeping, I guess." Larissa responded with bitter resignation. "It's something quite sexist that I don't like at all. It's part of all these old rules that should be corrected but are too entrenched in the system." It was a frustration similar to what Selfer was feeling at the walls, though Larissa had no way of knowing that. "But," Larissa continued, her small smile growing on her face, "thanks to Run, I now have a trick." She approached the window and summoned both her beasts in complete form. Her wind lynx, which had evolved during recent months, had now become a horned snow spirit, its form more ethereal and powerful than before. Her mineral fairy had undergone an even more dramatic transformation, now converted into a greater spiritual fairy that radiated luminous power. The two creatures were magnificent, their combined presence filling the room. "When they fuse completely," Larissa explained, "my control of wind, water, light, and earth increases to an enormous level. High gold level temporarily." Luna understood immediately. "You can activate the seal if you use your dull fusion?" "For a moment, yes, but we would have to get the seal from Arturo's office first." The implications were clear. They needed to infiltrate and steal an official artifact during a military crisis. "Where exactly is Arturo's office?" Luna asked. "Chapter 589, Taming the Swarm, 4, 3rd floor, West Wing. It normally has 2 guards, but with the crisis..." Larissa looked toward the window where she could see guards being redistributed to defensive positions throughout the castle. Probably only one, or maybe none if everyone's focused on the defense, Leora added, though her voice carried uncertainty about whether they could count on such luck. The problem is getting there undetected. Matilda observed. The main halls are going to be monitored. Luna studied the problem, her mind working through possibilities. Can we teleport inside? Larissa and I can't, Leora said, disappointment clear in her voice. We generate light flashes when we do it. I don't generate light. Luna smiled, touching the shadows that seemed to respond to her presence. My shadow jumping is completely silent and invisible. Yes, indeed. You're the best one to take the seal, Larissa concluded. Arturo was buried in his desk, surrounded by maps, troop lists, and logistical documents that seemed to multiply every time he looked up. He was managing the mobilization of almost all troops at his disposal, a task that normally required at least 3 competent people working in coordination. But such remained the magnitude of the crisis that no one was helping him. He had to obtain and send orders and resources through flying beast messages, didn't even have a secretary to take notes or bounce ideas off, and didn't even have a usual 2 guards at his door. They had been reassigned to support managing soldiers at more critical defensive points. Not that someone of his power level really needed personal guards, but their absence was indicative of how desperate the situation had become. Handling all the logistics without Julius's help was an enormously complicated task. Normally, his brother helped him coordinate troop movements and resource distribution. But since Julius was in the city, having left pursuing run, he couldn't leave this critical responsibility to anyone else. His half-brothers didn't have Chilans, which severely limited their capacity to handle the situation required. Victor, though competent in combat, frankly wasn't very good at the paperwork and detailed organization that a mobilization of the scale demanded. His mind wandered momentarily toward Larissa. She would have been perfect for this type of work. Her political mind, education, and meticulous attention to detail made her an ideal candidate for handling complex logistics. But she also didn't have a Chilan, which disqualified her from the most critical functions. Maybe an antiquated rule system, if it does leave out real talent. Arturo lamented this fact and sighed deeply, allowing himself a moment of melancholy while thinking about his younger sister and the complicated situation with their father. He had only received a dry pat on the shoulder from Julius, along with a brief message about handling things while he was away. But as a brother and son, he could understand the pain of missing an absent father, perhaps because he was more accustomed to Dragarian always spending much time outside the kingdom. He had already developed certain emotional resistance to paternal absences, but he had still suffered that sensation of abandonment during his youth. Suddenly, he felt a strange energy near his office. Someone knocked gently at the door. His perception was elevated due to his rank and experience, though nothing comparable to the supernatural level Ron had developed with his fungus or the specialized capabilities of creatures designed specifically for detection. Still, his high level allowed him to perceive mana patterns quite clearly, and he could tell that someone was deliberately hiding themselves. From the specific type of mana he detected, Maria, he approached the door sighing, thinking it was probably something related to Larissa. Maria often served as an intermediary when his younger sister, who had lived mostly confined these last years, had requests or concerns she didn't want to bring directly. But when he opened the door, he encountered a completely unexpected surprise. There was only Maria's crystal armadillo, with a mana concealment artifact on its nose. The beast, now silver rank, had grown to enormous dimensions and was covered with crystal formations that glowed softly in the hallway light. The beast barely fit in the wide corridor, its massive bulk occupying almost all available space. The armadillo offered him a carefully arranged bouquet of flowers, with a small folded note attached between the stems. Arturo took the note with curiosity and unfolded it. In Larissa's elegant calligraphy, it simply said, "I love you very much, big brother." Below was a blank line, clearly intended for a response. Arturo was someone who genuinely liked these types of affectionate and sentimental gestures, though few in the castle knew this due to his public image of political seriousness. He blushed slightly while taking the gift, feeling unexpected warmth in the middle of all the crisis and stress. The gesture reminded him of simpler times, when their family bonds weren't that complicated by politics and war, when love could be expressed through simple notes and flower arrangements. He looked toward both sides of the hallway to make sure no one had witnessed this vulnerable moment, then nervously headed back to his desk to find something to write with. He found an ornate quill in one of the drawers and began thinking of an appropriate response. His momentary focus on the sentimental task didn't allow him to notice that the official seal he had had on top of his desk moments before was missing. When he returned to the door to deliver his response, he sighed but smiled genuinely. Years had passed since Larissa had made these types of affectionate gestures with him. During her early childhood, she constantly sent him small gifts and notes, but since the war situation, those family traditions had sadly stopped. "Tell Larissa," he murmured to the armadillo while handing it the note with his response, "that I love her very much too, and that when this crisis ends, we're going to have proper time to talk about our family and some old rules." He handed the carefully folded response to the beast, which took it delicately in its crystalline jaws. He closed the door slowly, still discreetly checking that there wasn't anyone nearby who could have witnessed this exchange, then returned to sit at his desk to continue with the overwhelming logistics. When he settled back in his chair, the official seal was already on the table again, exactly where he had left it. His attention immediately returned to the documents that demanded his urgent attention, and in seconds he was completely absorbed in calculations of troop movements and resource allocation. Because of this and his joy at seeing his sister recovering, he didn't notice that the seal had a very light coat of shadow mana residue that would fade completely in a few seconds. But for now, that detail was irrelevant. Discover more novels at novelire.net. Nothing could darken Arturo's bright day now. Luna had what she needed, and the next phase of their plan was already in motion. Back in Larissa's room. "Your brother is sweet," Luna said, though her voice carried a note of guilt at having exploited his affection for Larissa. "And you know him, W." Maria's distraction worked perfectly. Larissa smiled, but there was sadness mixed with the relief. "He's been carrying so much responsibility alone. I should greet him more often when this is all over. We can feel guilty later," Mayo said. "Right now we need to escape from here." Chapter 590, Taming the Swarm, 5. Luna and the girls had already completed all their bureaucratic paperwork. The documents were sealed, signed, and technically legitimized by royal authority. Now they had to achieve something much more difficult: generate real achievements and demonstrate competence in the field. Specifically, Luna had to support the Starweaver side in the northern perimeter of the defensive area. This way she could function as a representative leader in her territory, and no one could allege that the sector had been abandoned by her family faction. Additionally, if her uncle's opposing faction wasn't present on their side, she would have certain legal priority in any subsequent Starweaver claims. Of course, for that to work, the important thing was that she didn't let the crisis take many casualties under her command, and that she could effectively coordinate the soldiers. This would be particularly difficult because those present were mostly not her troops, but upon arriving she would realize that as long as there was an intact defensive wall, and she contributed even minimally to maintaining it, it would be relatively easy to claim her participation as a leader, or so Larissa would say. It was a calculated plan that depended more on political optics than genuine heroism. Luna wasn't thrilled with this approach, but desperate circumstances required pragmatism over idealism. Meanwhile, in the center of the southernmost wall from where Luna and the girls were heading to provide support, Selfer remained strong, guiding troops with the experience of 37 decades of military leadership. The wall had already been restructured with small gaps and strategically organized so fire and wind tamers could easily launch their long-range attacks and control the constant flows of mutant beasts. The formation allowed efficient rotations, with fresh groups replacing those who became exhausted after intense periods of combat. The fire cadence had to be high due to the enormous number of fast-moving beasts, but if tamers quickly released their best attacks, they could last several minutes before needing replacement. As long as they had enough decent tamers to rotate adequately, the wall would resist despite the seemingly endless flow of creatures. It seemed the crisis wasn't as insurmountable as they had initially feared, now that several thousand tamers had effectively organized under centralized command. The coordination was working. Defenses remained stable even on Yino's side, and casualties on that front had stopped at acceptable numbers. Everything was going to be fine, or so it seemed, until in the distance, on the southern side perimeter, Selfra caught an energy signature several dozen kilometers away that made her blood freeze. It wasn't like the constant flow of small signatures from the lesser mutant creatures. This was much larger, more intense, more ominous. The magnitude of it sent instinctive warnings through every fiber of her experienced combat awareness. No, it wasn't just one. There were two massive signatures. Selfra concentrated, extending her perception to the maximum, trying to identify the signatures rapidly approaching. Soon she realized they were following smaller known energy signatures. Ren and Julius seemed to be fleeing from something, and what was pursuing them was exactly what she had sensed first. Julius and Run. Their normally enormous energies had been difficult to detect, so they must have been concealed or exhausted. "Captain," she shouted to her new second-in-command. "Yes, matriarch. Organize an elite group of flyers immediately. We have friendlies incoming with hostile pursuit. I need rescue and extraction right now." "Understood." Within minutes, a squadron of Golden Eagles and their riders rose from the wall, heading south at maximum speed. The flyers arrived just in time. Run, Julius, Zhao, Min, Taro, Shizu, and Mako were rescued easily, but the creatures did not stop their advance. The rescue group carried them back to the main wall, where healer teams were already waiting with advanced healing techniques. They received much more intensive healing than what an exhausted men had been providing during their desperate escape. The younger ones, Min, Taro, Lu, Shizu, and Mako, were completely unconscious from accumulated exhaustion, their bodies finally succumbing to strain they had been pushing through on adrenaline and determination alone. THS chapters updat by ovelfire.net. But Julius and Zhao managed to stay awake thanks to advanced healing and the Ashenway medicine Selfra had available to stay awake and energized in emergencies. Ren also wasn't knocked out, though he would clearly benefit from some healing for his overcharged system. Still, from everyone, he was the most active and energetic. The semi-purified seed in his system and the new power he had developed kept him fueled by strong emotions that he controlled increasingly better. His body appreciated professional healing, but his mind remained sharp and alert even without it. While they quickly explained the situation to Selfra, multiple corrupted artifacts, massive abominations, the real magnitude of their threat, Ren took advantage of the moment to tend to his companions and himself. He pulled out the small processed tentacles he kept in one of his backpacks within his Wolverine's dimensional space. Carefully, he cleaned the overcharged mana systems of Min, himself, and the others, eliminating crystallized residues they had accumulated during intense battles. In a few moments, the large beasts that had been pursuing them would arrive. Everyone could sense them better now without needing Selfra's elevated perception, simply due to their growing proximity. The main problem, Julius explained while observing the horizon, is that they constantly regenerate. We destroyed one's cores, its full body, but the big organic structures repair themselves using the same small monsters. Eliminating them doesn't seem to serve much purpose. Selfra processed this information quickly. If the creatures regenerated, traditional combat approaches would be ineffective in the long term. When the abominations finally appeared on the horizon, two massive forms that made the earth tremble with each step, Selfra decided not to overthink the situation and test for herself. "I'm going to freeze them," she declared simply. "Maybe that way I can stop them for an acceptable time while we develop a more permanent plan." The powerful matriarch advanced with a small group of her most trusted advisors, while Run, Zhao, and Julius observed from atop the enormous wall. Selfra extended her arms and released a portion of her power. The temperature dropped dramatically in a radius of several hundred meters, while a massive amount of ice began forming around the approaching beasts. In seconds, she created a small mountain of ice that completely encased the abominations with their two artifacts. The creatures were left completely immobile, trapped in ice so thick and hard it seemed more like crystal than frozen water. Selfra returned, carried by a golden eagle from one of her soldiers, clearly drained but satisfied with her work. From the tower, they watched her accomplishment while the flow of lesser creatures continued being repelled by high-rank fire and wind soldiers who rotated in shifts of a few minutes, pouring everything they had into maintaining the defenses. The formation looked solid and stable. If the ice prison could last a few hours, Sulfur could recharge completely and reform the barriers, potentially maintaining the massive threats blocked perpetually. It was an elegant solution, even if a simple one. But unfortunately, within minutes, the giant hand and leg inside the ice mountain glowed with awoken energy. The ice began cracking. Not only that, from the central side where Sulfur had been before coming to provide support, another massive signature could be sensed approaching. It seemed a third corrupted artifact was approaching. Damn, Sulfur murmured, watching her ice fortress begin to crack. It's not going to be that simple after all. Rin, already healed, observed the cracks expanding to the ice prison and felt emotions intensifying in his chest. The purified roots responded, but this time with more control and purpose. We need to find a way to cut them off from their energy source, he said quietly.
Enjoying the story? Like and subscribe to stay tuned for more. Drop a comment. For any new project suggestions,